Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Advances in SD Research, presented by Dysphonia International, formerly National Spasmodic Dysphonia Association. This webinar is being recorded and we will post it on our website for your later viewing and for people who are not able to join us today. And a reminder, our website is dysphonia.org. We encourage you to ask questions, and you can submit those questions by typing in the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. And we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box. We will answer as many questions as time permits during this session. But I want to assure you that all the questions will be answered, and Dr. Berke has graciously agreed to answer all of those. And so they will be recorded, and we will make them available as part 2 of the webinar on our website. I am pleased and honored to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Gerald Berke. Dr. Berke completed undergraduate and medical school at the University of Southern California. He did his surgical residency at UCLA, became an assistant professor, and then advanced to professor and chair of the Head and Neck Surgery Division at UCLA. He became the first chairman of the UCLA Department of Head and Neck Surgery. Dr. Berke is considered by his peers to be an international authority on laryngeal physiology. He developed the surgical procedure for AD, spasmodic dysphonia, known as SLAD-R. Dr. Berke has served as president of the American Laryngeological Association, the oldest subspecialty society in the United States, and also as president of the Traumatological Society, the nation's premier academic society in otolaryngology. And Dr. Berke has authored about 200 manuscripts based on laryngeal physiology and voice disorders, and mentored numerous residents and research fellows. He has served as one of 16 directors on the board of otolaryngology, and Dr. Berke serves as chairman of the Dysphonia International Scientific Advisory Board, which reviews and evaluates all research grant proposals that we receive. So, Dr. Berke.
Boy, that was a very nice introduction of me. I wish my wife was listening to it so that she would treat me maybe a little bit better. No, she's a wonderful lady. So thank you all for listening to me this afternoon. I hope that we have some interesting information to transmit to you. And as soon as you want, Kimberly, why don't you start the slides? So advances in spasmodic dysphonia research. As you notice, we have changed the name quite recently to Dysphonia International to represent that we plan staying with a lot of our research in the field of laryngeal dystonia, but we are going to expand to other dystonias as well. Basically, a dystonia is a problem that affects the voice. And having said that, we are using the word international to represent that we are going to certainly try to get together people from all over the world who are interested in dealing with these disorders so that we can group ourselves together and achieve our goals more quickly. Next slide. So I thought it would be important and interesting to look at the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, the NIDCD, because they do fund the primary amount of our research. And recently they have listed that they've developed 4 priority areas: normal function, disease and disorders, diagnosis, treatment, and prevention, and improving outcomes. And each one of these priorities has a list of research themes. For example, normal function would include development, molecular and the microenvironment, homeostasis. Next slide. So some generic themes for improving outcome, which is kind of why we're all here today, is better metrics for diagnosis and treatment. Currently right now, spasmodic dysphonia doesn't have a lot of metrics that we can use to diagnose patients other than sophistication with our ears, and certainly very few metrics for deciding whether or not a particular treatment is actually helping patients or not. Some other themes include clinical trials, and some of those we'll talk about today, and they're ongoing. Emerging technologies such as AI. Recently I reviewed a number of grants for the NIDCD, and almost every one of those grants had a machine learning as kind of the backbone of the study. Nanotechnology, prosthetics, comparative effectiveness of new treatments and bioengineering advances. Also included would be evidence-based medicine, which is very popular now. Whether or not it's actually achieved its goals is hard to say. Personalized medicine in the same vein, best practices, and then population health studies. Next slide. So as with any type of research endeavor, there's always some low-hanging fruit. That is to say, things that probably aren't that hard to look at and get some information on. So large database epidemiologic studies such as abstinence for smoking, human papillomavirus vaccination, et cetera. Better diagnostic and treatment metrics, which we just talked a little bit about, rehab studies, of course, affecting voice and speech therapeutics. Next slide. But there are other advances on the horizon, which if they came to reality, would actually make tremendous progress in our ability to deal with some of the problems that face us now. That includes stem cell regeneration, genetic modification of inherited diseases. Obviously, spasmodic dysphonia has a very strong genetic factor involved, although most patients are sporadic and not familial. Advances in neuroscience, new procedures, prosthetics, new drugs, vaccines, and unrealized ways of caring for patients with common disorders. Next slide. So we're going to talk about projects that have been funded not only by the NSDA, but also that are being funded currently to some extent by the NIDCD, which we believe are important. And Dr. Christina Simonian has turned out to be a very important researcher in the field of dystonia and also spasmodic dysphonia. So I wanted to mention some of the studies that are currently ongoing for which she is likely the PI on, the investigator. The first thing that I wanted to mention was that there's a new multidisciplinary center which is being funded by the NIDCD, which cuts across 4 academic medical institutions that will be committed to conducting research on laryngeal dystonia and voice tremor. This includes Harvard and its affiliated hospitals, the University of California, San Francisco, and also the University of Utah. And she, in addition to that, has some other quite interesting things that are going on. So the next grant that is being currently looked at, and I think they're in the process of trying to develop patient volunteers, would be assessing the feasibility and efficacy of novel neurofeedback brain-computer interface, BCI treatment in patients with laryngeal dystonia. And actually, this is kind of a virtual reality study where the patients will be wearing virtual reality headsets, and this will be used in a way to kind of get a better idea of whether or not they can be treated in this fashion and how that treatment affects their diagnosis and also future voice. There's a deep learning platform entitled Dystonia Net that actually looks at very sophisticated MRIs, and there's good data to show that in the future, or even currently, that certain magnetic resonant studies could be used to help diagnose patients with dystonia as a neurobiomarker. And this was done again by using artificial intelligence to kind of pick out those MRIs which represent patients with dystonia. And then finally, I wanted to spend a moment on a drug that's actually been around for quite a while, sodium oxybate, also called Xyrine, which may have some utility, probably does have utility in helping patients that have laryngeal sensitivity to alcohol. For those that have a drink and all of a sudden find their voice is improved, sodium oxybate is certainly in the offing as another drug that may represent that for patients. Now, having said that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the critique of any particular drug or any particular study right now, because I don't think that's really the foundation of what we're discussing right now. But I think it's important to remember that I'm giving you the plus side of everything that we're talking about this afternoon. Next slide. So research progress. It's interesting that when spasmodic dysphonia was around 50 years ago, they kind of thought that it was a psychological disorder, that it really wasn't a neurologic disorder. And in fact, Herb Dito, who was at San Francisco, was one of the first pioneers that recognized that the patients that have this disease are not having psychological problems. Indeed, it was a neurological problem that was influenced by mood and emotions, etc. And I think the nice thing is that really within the last 10 years, there's been an increased interest in the research for voice disorders, fortunately. And really, there's been a lot more research on new treatment options for patients. Having said that, many of the grants that are funded and will be funded are focused on basic research to understand the cause of the disease, because frankly, despite the fact that we have a lot of interesting studies going on, I think the ultimate problem has not been entirely identified, and still a lot more work needs to be done. Next slide. So I wanted to spend just another moment on funding sources, because really research doesn't get accomplished without support. So the NIH includes most of the large-scale awards for dystonia research. And that includes training awards as well. We need to train the next series of researchers and clinicians that are interested in these problems. There are institutional grants, of course, which are small grants. They're maybe not as exciting because most people, when they get grants, not only are they interested in a subject, but they're hoping to get promoted by their institution for that. There are society grants. The Academy of Otolaryngology has grants, small grants. These are almost always startup funds. The Triological Society gives out grants to young investigators and investigators that are in training as well as a supplement to their training. The American Laryngological Association and the American Bronchoesophagological Association also have startup funds for grants, and these can be very important. The trial once looked at the hit rate for getting R01 grants, which are main grants from the NIDCD, and they found that it may be up to 40% of people that attained one of these small grants ended up transferring to a large NIH grant, which we were surprisingly and happy to see. So there are also foundation and industry grants. The NSDA, of course, Dysphonia International gives out these grants to investigators all over the country, and now even internationally, perhaps. And industry grants. So a little bit of the problem with industry grants is that the industry doesn't want to report negative findings. They all want their grants to provide them with more money, and that isn't always the best thing in the world. And then finally, donors. And donors represent an important source of funding, not only for small grants, but also for coming up with new things that really might not be in the domain of giving out a scientific grant. And these would be in the form of gifts or even endowments, which are grants that are given to an institution and are put in a fund to collect on the interest. But some of them are actually quasi-endowments, which means that at times the principal can be used if necessary as well. So all of these funding sources are what's going to lead to an ultimate cure for spasmodic dysphonia. Next slide. So Dysphonia International Research Portfolio, which I'm going to discuss, has given out over $500,000, which has been funded pretty much from donors like the people that are listening right now. Thank you so much, since 2009. And if you want a full list of the grants, that's available at dysphonia.org. Next slide. So in 2007, the NSDA, in their infinite wisdom, if I might use that term, decided that they needed to establish a scientific advisory board and appointed Dr. Christy Ludlow as the chair of that board. Now, many of you may know or may not know of Dr. Ludlow's contribution, but for many years, she was the only voice researcher at the NIDCD and provided some fundamental knowledge about the nature of spasmodic dysphonia with her studies at that time. And we all need to take our hats off to what she has helped us understand and the organization of future researchers in this study. At that time that it was funded, the SAB Scientific Advisory Board was charged with reviewing grant applications and providing future directions for research and fostering collaboration with researchers. The first meeting was held in February 2008, included Christy, myself, Craig Evinger, who's a PhD neuroscientist, Lori Azelius, who's probably the premier person in studying the DNA and genes that might be related to the development of spasmodic dysphonia, and Carly Tanner, who's also a neuroepidemiologist. At that time, several grants were reviewed. A summary of the research priorities was published in 2008 and has provided a basis for NSDA research programs since then. I was extremely fortunate to have been appointed the next chair for the Scientific Advisory Board, and I can tell you that there's a lot of interesting research that's going on all over many countries right now, and almost all of it is under the aegis of the people that are in this organization. Next slide. So we're all interested in new treatments. That's kind of why we're here this afternoon. And Dr. Christopher Honey, I wanted to give you a small quote from him. It says, "We are all approaching the same problem with different techniques." And that is entirely true, that all of us are working towards the goal of delivering better voice and a better way of life for people that are suffering from spasmodic dysphonia. So Dr. Honey himself, who was a neurosurgeon in the University of British Columbia, noticed that in some of the patients that they were doing deep brain stimulation on that had Parkinson's disease or tremor, but also had spasmodic dysphonia, improved with this deep brain stimulation. And the NSDA has been central in helping to start some studies of this, which are looking at whether this treatment would be used for the most extreme cases of SD that are pretty much non-responsive to other treatments. Jürgen Konzak, who's at the University of Minnesota, has been testing a vibrotactile stimulation device, which fits around the neck, not in terms of choking. And the study that we funded is involving abductor dystonia. But the team has already have proven that voice improvement using this technique can occur for patients with SD. It's kind of a non-invasive neuromodulation device, which kind of vibrates the larynx. And I think the description of why it seems to be helpful is very complicated, but nevertheless, the patients do improve from it. Teresa Kimberly is a great friend to our organization and is currently at Massachusetts General Hospital. And she's investigating the effects of repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation devices, also the mnemonic of RTMS, on individuals with abductor SD. Their team has, again, worked using this and has shown some improvement in treating individuals with adductor SD. I think the first treatment for it really was used in patients with hand dystonia that actually got fairly long-term benefit from it. And again, there are a lot of issues and a lot of questions that still need to be answered, but it's an important attribute to many patients in the future, I believe. Next slide. So measurement tools. I told you that we don't have very many measurement tools, unfortunately, for spasmodic dysphonia. But some that our Dysphonia International have supported would be number one, Dr. Rosen, Clark Rosen, who's at the University of San Francisco and has a new diagnostic tool which may help us better understand how the vocal folds are responding to stimuli. You know, patients with spasmodic dysphonia don't respond like normal folks when you stimulate their larynx. They kind of have a hyper response to it. And it's postulated that this hyper response somehow relates to the development of the disorder and modulates the dystonia that occurs. Dr. Mendelsohn, who's my buddy at UCLA, and working with the Dystonia Coalition, and I must give a little bit of credit to Dr. Berke in that regard, have just finished developing a new device that can actually just look at video recordings of patients with spasmodic dysphonia and can use those to actually identify the degree of severity that the patients are exhibiting. Again, this is a machine learning project, but it has been successful and it just got published in a really good journal, Speech and Hearing Research, an excellent, highly refereed journal. Michael Pittman, who's at Columbia, is conducting a multi-center study to validate a measurement tool called Communication Participation Item Bank, which also can be used to quantify severity of SD and response to treatment, which, as I mentioned, is sorely lacking. And the reason that we need that is because if you're going to compare the response to treatment across centers, or somebody says, this is working, we need an objective measurement scale that will tell us whether or not this indeed is actually occurring. Next slide. So causation and brain activity. You know, it's, I think, well understood now that this is a neurological disorder and that some disordered communication in the brain is leading to most of the effects that patients seem to exhibit. So Scott Norris and Evan Gordon at Washington are examining how dysfunctional individual brain networks are being modified by botulinum toxin treatment in spasmodic dysphonia adductor. But I think what else is really important about Scott Norris is that heretofore, before he was looking at functional MRIs, which can be used to study areas of the brain, especially in the speech cortex, aren't functioning properly. Prior to his investigation, it was determined that this was a global problem. That is to say, there were many foci in the brain that were had poor connectivity and were contributing to the problem. But by looking at these functional MRIs more closely, he was able to determine that it was a local connectivity disorder. And that's important because if it's a global problem, it will be much more difficult to treat and cure than if it's just a localized area of connectivity that's not functioning properly. And then Teresa Kimberly, in addition to studying RTMS's treatment, is also using functional MRI to evaluate brain function among individuals with abductor spasmodic dysphonia. John Howe at San Francisco is, in addition, using brain imaging, magnetoencephalography, MEG, to observe neural activity during speech in people who have SD and who have both SD and tremor. And he's got some really interesting findings because if he has them wear headphones and they can actually feed back voicing and delay it to see what effect that actually has on spasmodic dysphonia and tremor. And the results are really quite exciting. And Michael Hammer is also looking at the sensory system, feeling and brain systems and how they contribute to voice interruptions experienced by individuals with SD. These are all studies that have been piloted by Dysphonia International and now have attained large-scale funding for the work. Next slide. So the NSDA Dysphonia International's role. So our role has primarily been seed grants that may lead to larger grants, that will lead to larger grants through the NIH. We're in the process of increasing collaboration among researchers. Because we are kind of central to the work that's ongoing, we are in a unique position to get researchers that are interested in looking at this disorder from different aspects using the same methodology to hope to work together. And this includes international teams. We just spent time this morning talking with one of the major researchers and another group in another country that have similar methodology, and hoping that they can get together because, really, you need a lot of patients, both the genetics of many patients and many patients to get results on in order to determine whether some of these new techniques are actually worthwhile and should be looked into more closely. We have been providing research travel awards for young investigators for annual professional conferences. We are currently and have been in the past participating in the Harvard Brain Bank and Virtual Global Dystonia Registry. And finally, I think we are one of the primary organizations that have been helping with recruitment of patients for research and clinical studies. And really, I can't tell you how fortunate we are to have people in our group and affiliated with our group that have helped support all this research. And a lot of these new studies and new approaches to looking at dystonia would not be possible without their support. So if I had a hat on, I would take it off to you because you are really responsible for a lot of the work that has been ongoing and will continue to go on. Next slide. Questions and answers. Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Berke. Appreciate that. Was a fantastic amount of information and insight. So we appreciate that very, very much. I think we'll start with a couple of questions that was submitted to us in advance. And this person is saying that their symptoms, their voice symptoms of SD, disappear when they're acting in a stage play, or they maybe get angry at something and their voice may actually improve, or in some cases, it will get worse. So your thoughts about that, Dr. Berke?
It's a great question. And it actually relates to the fact that they used to think that this was a psychological disorder because patients that had spasmodic dysphonia, if they would laugh or get angry or stressed out, their voice would change. And so they thought, God, that must be psychological. It can't be medical. It can't be neurological. But what they, I think, ceased to realize in some of those early thoughts about it was that the speech center and the speech processes in humans and hominoids has been going on for at least 6 million years, and far beyond that, because in lower animals, mammals that existed even before hominoids, they've always had the ability to communicate with one another, not necessarily by spoken language, but certainly by their activities and grunts. And we have this ability to modify what we're thinking and the way our voice comes out by the limbic system. And for those of you that have taken physiology knows that the limbic system is a very primordial system that has both flight and fear centers. And I suspect that when you're getting mad or when you're in a play and stressed out, that some of the speech signals that are coming from our cortex is kind of interfacing with the limbic system, and it's modifying those. And some of those primal systems probably don't have spasmodic dysphonia as part of their genetic makeup. And it's much more easier to use expression using the limbic system at times. And so I'm not surprised, and I don't think you should be surprised either, that your emotions and your stress can affect your voice.
Okay, great. Another question, Dr. Berke, is this person is talking about they have recently heard and saw information about focused ultrasound treatment and your thoughts on the efficacy of that for voice disorders, particularly spasmodic dysphonia.
So, we all think of ultrasound as kind of this tool that's used to image a baby when it's in the mother's womb, and it's a very benign process. But the focused ultrasound that they're referring to is indeed not that at all. And most of the focused ultrasound that's been used for patients with severe essential tremor has been used to perform a thalamotomy, basically to destroy part of the thalamus in order to reduce the tremors. And so it's not a benign process. And there are a lot of side effects that can occur with this. It's almost like getting radiation or a destructive force. And if you don't think that it can be destructive, just ask the people then, the Cuba and some of the Eastern countries that were underwent focused ultrasound in their hotel rooms, how they've been doing with it. So I think we need to be a little bit askance just because somebody writes something that doesn't have a lot of background to it and may actually cause more harm than good.
Thank you, Dr. Berke. Excellent. We've got quite a few questions submitted to us. One is asking, is Botox still considered the gold standard for treatment?
Absolutely, absolutely. It has taken a group of patients that heretofore there were practically no treatments for it and have allowed them to return to almost a normal existence. And I think all patients that develop dystonia, spasmodic dysphonia, need to undergo Botox treatment as a first step in seeing whether or not their dystonia can be managed. And I wholeheartedly support Botox as the gold treatment, and likely it will remain the gold treatment for many years to come.
Thank you, sir. Along those lines, a question comments that most of us rely on Botox injections. Different doctors do it differently with regard to access and dosage. Can you talk about any research regarding the best techniques for administering the Botox injections?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, there aren't papers that have compared across techniques. And I would say, and the reason for that is because there's a greater difference between physicians giving Botox than there is between the technique that's used to give the Botox. And I'm sure that's true. And, you know, every now and then I'll get a letter from a physician who wants to treat a patient with Botox, and he starts to ask me, how do you prepare the Botox? How much do you drop? How do you, and the truth of the matter is that there's great variability. It's not like taking a pill. You can't take a 10 milligram pill of Botox and feel better. Every patient, Botox dose is different, and the dosing and the way that the Botox is actually given to the patient varies greatly. And in fact, I tell patients, you know, after a while, you're going to be telling me how you want me to give you Botox. I'm not going to be telling you. So I think the answer to that question is, it would be impossible to come out and say this technique is better than that technique, because it's incumbent upon the doctor that's administering the Botox to become the professional in giving the Botox and giving it properly so that patients have good results. And that can happen. Many, many patients are able to get great results from the Botox. I have patients that I've treated for 25 years or more with Botox, 30 years. They come in and they remind me, and I go, oh my God, I'm getting old.
Okay, let's see. Here's an interesting question, Dr. Berke. Any research, does any research exist studying connection between respiratory and ADSD? I have problems with shortness of breath while eating, talking, and relaxing. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Actually, there is Dr. Hammer's research has studied that basically because there are pulmonary stretch receptors. The other word for them are the Herring-Brewer reflexes. And it's been shown that the pulmonary stretch receptors have the greatest import to the closing forces of the larynx. And by that, I mean that when you take a deep breath and you hold it, and you try, if you take a deep breath and you hold it and you feel, where do I feel the sensation from this? You feel it in your larynx. And it so happens that patients that have pulmonary problems not infrequently have associated laryngeal problems that go along with it as well. So the pulmonary system is part of the speech system just as much as the vocal cords, just as much as the resonance structures, my tongue and my oral cavity. And there are sensory receptors which feed to the brain and feed to the larynx, which are supplied by the pulmonary system. But that's a good question.
Boy, lots of questions about Botox, Dr. Berke. This one is one that I'm sure you hear and I hear frequently. This person said Botox has stopped working after 15 years.
Yeah.
Should I try Botox B, and if so, is it effective?
The answer to the question is there are a variety of newer Botoxes, Botox B, I think there's a Botox C, and yes, many of them have efficacy. Some don't work quite as well as Botox A. Some may actually work better under certain circumstances. And it's there's a central place where you can send blood to see whether a patient has developed antibodies. I saw the other day that somebody did a very clever thing. They just injected Botox into somebody's forehead. And if they didn't have fewer wrinkles than before, then they assumed that the Botox wasn't working, which may be true. And it actually, in patients where the Botox has stopped working, it's not that hard to get a bottle of Botox B. The formulation is a little bit different than Botox A, but you can try and see if it's actually efficacious in that regard. And it's likely that after years and years of treatment with Botox, you may have developed some immunity to it.
And here's a question that currently is certainly is relevant for us, all of us, the last 2 or 3 years. And the question is, have you seen patients who have developed SD as a result of COVID? And if so, how many or what frequency do you see?
I don't think I have, but I've seen many patients that have developed voice problems related to COVID. Usually it involves weakness of the vocal cords from paresis all the way to paralysis. And, unfortunately, COVID can affect the brain, and it's not unreasonable to believe that some connectivity that exists between inhibitory areas of the brain and the speech centers might get affected by it. And so I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are a number of, I will hopefully, God hope, not a lot of people, but some people that after COVID may have dystonia and or tremor.
Right. Another question says, why does my Botox cause choking? I need more than I can tolerate, but do not want to ask for an increase in dosage.
When you say choking, you mean choking on food, choking on liquid? I'm assuming you're not talking about just choking.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The question didn't delineate there. So probably in food and liquids, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Because it weakens the vocal cords. And if the dose is large enough, the vocal cords will stay open when, we close our vocal cords when we swallow. And if the vocal cords don't close completely or almost completely when we swallow, liquid can leak between our vocal cords and cause aspiration. So it's extremely important that the dose that's given is a dose that works. If it almost sounds like the patient needs large doses and for some reason those doses are either causing the vocal cords to stay too open and so their voice is bad and they don't realize it. It's hard, it's impossible for me in this venue to really look at it, but I would say whoever is giving you the Botox needs to reassess how much he's giving you and where he's giving it and the technique that they use.
Here's an interesting question. Is it common for patients to have more significant spasms with ADSD on one side of their laryngeal muscles than the other? Or are the muscles more generally affected symmetrically? I ask because I receive unilateral injections alternating sides, and it seems as though I don't receive equal results on each side.
The simple answer to your question is yes. Yeah, some patients with SD exhibit more spasm on one side than the other, although the vocal cords are pretty well locked in the brainstem together. You never see one vocal cord open and the other one closed. They either both open or they both close. And the rate and force of closure is usually pretty symmetric. Having said that, there are patients where the dystonia seems to be a little more prevalent on one side, but the fact that unilateral injections work, and many of my patients get unilateral injections, I think is more a focus of the fact that the Botox probably transfers to the opposite side as well. I'm sure it's not just staying on one side. When you inject Botox into the larynx, there's a lot of ways that it can kind of cross over the front of the larynx to the other muscle groups that are available there. And the predominant feature would be on one side, but I'm sure they get some results from the Botox on the other side as well.
Interesting question that says, the person said, I have ADSD with tremor. I also have moderate to severe white matter disease and genetic Charcot-Marie Tooth type 2N. So how might all of this have effects on my ADSD?
Well, I mean, obviously, that's a global functional connectivity problem, and it's entirely likely that at many areas in the system, there are defects occurring that are contributing to your adductor spasmodic dysphonia, and at the same time producing tremor. It's a serious disorder. We don't have a good way of treating it right now, and well, all we can do is just hope that in the future, as we get a better hold of genetic modification, which is one of the things that are hanging out there, they'll be able to treat those diseases more effectively.
This person is asking or saying, I have mixed SD, and Botox is very touch and go for me. And are there any new treatments or any existing treatments more effective for mixed SD?
A good question. So mixed SD is a difficult disease because they're kind of counterintuitive in the sense that spasmodic dysphonia is a disease, adductor variety is a disease where the vocal cords close too tightly during speech. And the abductor form is a disease where the vocal cords close, they don't, in some senses, it closes in a delayed fashion. They oftentimes don't close tightly enough, if you might think about it like that. And so it becomes very difficult to treat both entities. And typically what we have to do is treat the one that seems like it's the most prevalent and hope that we have ways of managing the one that's less prevalent. So in some patients, not all, but in some patients with adductor dystonia, they can undergo procedures that actually push the vocal cords closer together. We call them thyroplasties, and it's on our website. And in some of these patients, you can do thyroplasties for the abductor portion and then give them Botox injections for the adductor portion. Obviously, everybody is an individual, and you really have to go to your doctor and see what they think is the most appropriate therapy for it.
Okay, I'm going to change gears just a bit, Dr. Berke. This question is, what medications are currently most effective for vocal tremor?
I don't know all the medicines that are that super effective for vocal tremor. There's quite a few. And it's really I treat vocal tremor usually. So there's basically two types of, well, I shouldn't say two, there's at least two types of vocal tremor. One is a tremor that's what we term a dystonic tremor. That is to say, the tremor occurs due to the connectivity deficits that exist within patients with spasmodic dysphonia, which seems to be related to an inhibitory function of the speech center. There's another tremor which is more prevalent that occurs in the upper limb, and typically we call that essential tremor, which doesn't occur just when you're speaking, but actually the vocal cords are tremulous when they're not even speaking. And so those are mostly treated by neurologists, the essential tremor forms, where the vocal or peripheral tremors, body tremors. Conversely, dystonic tremor is mostly treated by laryngologists and some neurologists. And many patients with dystonic tremor get better with Botox. They also get better when you have the ability to reduce the muscular effort that's causing the tremor. And some patients, believe it or not, with tremor can get better when you push the vocal cords closer together, because even though they're tremulous, when they're together, you don't hear as much tremor in the voice. So there's a lot of techniques, and frankly, I'm not up on all the new medicines because I don't actually prescribe those for patients. I send them to movement disorder neurologists.
All right, sir. Here's an interesting question. Is there research being done on muscle tension dysphonia?
not enough research on muscle tension dysphonia. It's a disease that can take many forms. Some laryngologists think that there are 7 forms of muscle tension dysphonia. I'm kind of a lumper, not a splitter, and so I don't try and divide them up into little categories. But it's a very difficult disorder to manage, and it can go on for a long time. Having said that, some patients, even with muscle tension dysphonia, can respond to small injections of Botox. And some patients with spasmodic dysphonia have compensatory muscle tension dysphonias that go along with it. So the panoply of ways that humans can express their voice disorder is very large and is extremely complicated.
We have a few questions, Dr. Berke, regarding the SLAD surgery. And I'm going to try to summarize a few of them here into maybe 1 or 2 questions. Generally, what some people are asking is, are you still doing the SLAD surgery? And could you explain a little bit more about the surgery, what you do, and how it works, and how it makes a person's voice, and it improves a person's voice?
The first answer to the question is yes. We just did somebody, I think, a month or 2 ago, which I just talked to on a phone call. Seems to be doing quite well. Is happy. Recently, a lot of the patients recognize that we have another procedure called kind of a myomectomy that we've been doing, and a lot of them have been coming over for that. But to try and summarize the SLAD surgery, it would take a long time to really give you the background that led to the development of it and what it does, except to say that there are nerve branches from the brain that go to the muscles, the intrinsic muscles of the larynx, that are responsible for the hypermuscularity that occurs and the tremor that occurs. And basically, that surgery was a surgery that utilizes the microneuroanatomy of the larynx, that we could go in there and actually sever that muscle and use a nerve, and use a nerve from another portion of the body, the nerve that goes to the strap muscles. These are the muscles that raise and lower the larynx, to bypass that nerve that was causing the spasm. And we were very fortunate that we were able to demonstrate in humans that it does work and has longevity. And many of the patients that we've been able to treat have had long-term relief of their symptoms using that. And it's simply a matter of rewiring the system a little bit to make it more useful for speech.
Okay. And you just touched on myomectomy a little bit, Dr. Berke. We also have a few questions asking about, and it's a couple of people are referring to it as muscle revision surgery. And they're saying that if they have participated in other studies, like Christine Simonyan's studies, for example, would that create an issue of having the, again, they refer to as muscle revision surgery?
Well, let me just back up a little bit. Not 100% sure what the question really is, except it's likely that if you have a surgery that changes the muscular environment of the larynx, it should and would affect functional MRI studies that are related to that, although I don't think a large group of patients have been studied, although Christy Ludlow studied a couple patients and thought that they definitely had changes consistent with changing that. And in addition, it's conceivable that, if you're changing the muscular effort, that would somehow feed back to the to the speech center of the brain, because it's felt that a lot of the reason that patients have spasmodic dysphonia is because the sensory system is not functioning properly as well. So maybe in a way of trying to summarize things that are extremely complicated, it's probably important to realize that there's an afferent system, a sensory system, and an efferent system. And we use that to control the muscular effort in our body. And when those get changed, it changes our ability to produce sound and to produce voice and speech. And the goal is to modulate those so that we can get as close to normal as possible.
Okay. A couple of questions along the lines of, are there any new or improved surgical interventions in the works?
I think we've presented everything that I think is on the horizon that looks like it's new. And, I mean, the SLAD-R surgery has been around since the early 90s. And the Koreans were doing myomectomies, and I used to do open myomectomies for patients, but now we've kind of determined a way to do them in a closed fashion without an incision. And it clearly holds some promise as well as being an effective way to manage these disorders. And I'm hoping that if it proves to be that useful, that there'll be doctors all over the country that can apply those techniques.
Fantastic. This is an interesting question, Dr. Berke. Which current research study do you find most promising in being a potential game changer for those of us living with SD?
That's a good question. I think Teresa's studies using repetitive TMS is an extremely innovative approach to dealing with this disorder, because they've known for a long time that there is an inhibitory foci in our brain that helps control the degree of closure of our vocal cords, and that modulating that, which it can be modulated through repetitive transmagnetic stimulation, holds great potential. I think the real question right now is, how long would it last for? Would it have any long-lasting side effects? Is it something that's could actually spread throughout the United States and be used by various centers? There's a lot of data that still needs to be attained in order to come up with some of those answers. But I think it's a novel treatment, and it shows that we are interested in being at the penetrating point of the cutting edge when it comes to the treatment of spasmodic dysphonia.
Very interesting. I'm going to wrap up with a global type question for you, Dr. Berke. And based on your experience and knowledge, you've talked a lot about Botox has been around since 1984 and is still considered the primary treatment for SD. And then you've talked about various surgical procedures. So let's say in maybe 20 years, what do you see, based on some of the comments you made and talking about AI and machine learning and so forth, what do you see as a real possibility of a treatment for SD in 20 years?
You know, the science of dealing with our genetic structure is becoming more sophisticated every day, by the minute. I mean, there was a time when they sequenced the DNA genome of humans, and it was like sending the James Webb telescope up into space. Even now, it's common. They can do it on anybody, within a fairly short period of time. And they have ways of modifying the genome, cutting out genes, adding genes. They're getting better at it all the time. And it's likely that within the next 20 years or 25 years, many of these disorders that are genetically based, whether they be sporadic or whether they be familial, they'll be able to go in there and correct the DNA. Who knows? They may even be able to correct it in utero. I mean, the science is becoming so far advanced to what it was 10, 15 years ago. It's almost unbelievable. And we just have to wait. That's why the next generation of researchers have to be supported and encouraged and funded, because that's really what holds the keys to unlocking many of the problems that we are still dealing with as humans.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berke. It's fantastic, and we just can't thank you and appreciate you so much for all your help and support and the opportunity to work with you. So thank you so much. And I wanted to again remind everyone participating on the call, we have quite a few questions that we did not have time to answer, but Dr. Berke will answer those, and they will be posted as part 2 of the webinar. So we will have another webinar in our series in August, probably toward the end of August. So stay tuned for that, and keep your eye out for the particular dates and the speakers and topics and so forth. So thank all of you for participating today. And as Dr. Berke has said, we cannot do any of this work without all of you and your help and your contributions. So my sincere thanks and appreciation to each and every one of you.
Yeah, let me just say, it's been a privilege to be able to take care of these patients and deal with their problems and try and help them. It's been one of the joys of my life, and I am so appreciative of all the support that I've received. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And everyone have a good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are.